in this chapter, what we're looking at here is, now after having looked at the macroeconomic statistics, we want to get an idea of how economies grow. And this is a pretty important chapter because this is a lot of reason why people become economists in the first place, is because of this idea that reducing poverty and people being better off just from lack of people being better off because they have knowledge of economics. A lot of this comes back to this chapter of how do you make economies grow? Because economic growth basically means a healthier population, it means less war, it means more prosperity generally. So we're not just pushing for economic growth just to make people rich, we also think it leads to lots of other things. And if we want to think about how important this chapter is as well, think of, the famous economist that many of us know of, Adam Smith, who in 1776 wrote the book The Wealth of Nations, which was a book basically saying, asking the question, why is England so rich, which at the time was the richest country in the world? Why is England so rich and why are other countries so poor? So this idea of economic growth has been a long-running theme among modern-day economists. So, when we think of economic growth today, the country we obviously think a great deal of today would be China. And it's remarkable. China, in just a few decades, has grown from a poor agricultural, heavily centrally powered, organized economy to, yes, it's still technically a communist country, but the market economy has largely taken over, and it's a rapidly growing economy. By rapidly growing, we've got a 9% growth rate for the past 20 years. That's quite significant. And most of that started in 1979. The late 70s is when China took that turn towards having a stronger growing economy. What's significant about a 9% growth rate versus a 6% growth rate, yes, it's only 3%, but the issue would be is that then in year 2, you're growing off of a slightly larger base. So the idea is that even to grow the economy by just a fraction of a percent can actually lead to a significant difference over time. And that difference not only is in terms of greater economic prosperity, but also this idea that the standard of living improves. That means you have better health, right? Less war and disorder. And generally, we just think of the people as being happier. All these things come with economic growth. Not guaranteed, but it's more likely you'll have these things as the economy grows. And you see part of that right here. That there's less crime, more people go to college, people live longer, all great things, right? And all that comes, the only way you can send people to college is when you have a stronger growing economy. The only way in which people can live longer is if we're devoting the resources we have to better health care, which we can now do. And obviously there's less crime if people are working and too busy to commit crimes overall. So how do we measure it? We measure it largely we measure economic growth with real GDP. Real GDP, again, is controlling for price changes. And the way that it controls for price changes is that I take base year prices times current year quantities. To get the real GDP. I could also do the GDP per capita. GDP per capita just means I take my real GDP and divide it by the population, which isn't that big a deal. But the key idea here is that I'm removing the effects of inflation. I'm allowing for price changes to not be reflected because I'm going to have a base year and I'm just going to always take those prices. When we referred to that idea that small changes can lead to significant changes over a longer time period, the idea again was that for any growing economy, what you like to see is you don't like to see dramatic changes in how the economy is growing, from year to year. But the idea is that, again, if you just slowly change the performance of the economy in 1 year, then the next year, if the economy is going to grow in year 2 by 1%, we know that for certain. In year 1, if I can get a slightly larger increase, I'm going to grow a slightly larger number by 1%. Right? So again, this idea of compounding is that growth builds upon prior growth. Small changes. You don't need big plays here. I don't need to get the economy to grow by 20% in a year. That would actually be a pretty bad thing. Look at this stark difference here. Mexico and the U.S. A 0.8% difference over the past 100 years on average. But that's 0.8% times 0.8% times 0.8% and so on to the 100th power, which means then today that because of compounding, that life in the U.S. is significantly better. There's certainly less crime. I mean, you think of violent crimes. Well, I don't know, actually. I guess there's violent crimes everywhere. But we could certainly say in terms of the healthcare system, if you can afford it in the U.S., is significantly better than it is in Mexico. And just the standard of living in general is better in Mexico, or better in the U.S. than in Mexico. What economists use is something called the Rule of 70. What that Rule of 70 does is it allows me to estimate the change of growth in the economy. And what I do is I take the percentage growth in the economy as a whole number. So for instance, if the economy is growing by 5%, then I simply take 70 divided by 5, right? And I'll see that it'll take approximately 14 years for the economy to double. Right now, just for all intents and purposes, the Chinese economy is largely growing at a 7% rate. That would mean that the economy is doubling every 10 years. That's pretty significant, and that's a pretty big economy. When we take that forward then, how can I make the economy grow? Well, in the short run, I can make the economy grow by just adjusting things. I can make the economy grow by, if we look at this from the perspective of the production possibilities frontier, I can get small growth by being just below the PPF and getting closer to it. That's actually pretty easy. Right? I get some people that are unemployed, now employed. I get some buildings that were not used. I start to get them used. This is how we can get short-run growth rather easy, by just finding ways to use underused resources. The trickier thing is the long-run economic growth. And in terms of long-run economic growth, what we're looking for here is I'm actually looking to shift out the PPF, meaning that I need more resources. That's harder. Takes a lot longer to get. Look at that. Beautiful picture here. Much better than what I had. There's your short run. There's your long run. I'm not sure if we need to waste 2 slides on that, but guess that's what it is. So what are those things that then I need to do to change to grow the economy? That would be the resources that are within the production possibilities frontier. The land and the natural resources that are beneath the land, above the land, the workers, the laborers, the capital that I have, that would be both the knowledge that people have, the human capital, and the physical capital, buildings, machines. And then entrepreneurship, technology, ideas. Anything that changes these can help the economy grow. When we look at that, we need to have a production function again. That production function will be the way that I convert the inputs into outputs. And when I look at this production function in terms of economic growth and how that affects things, what I'm looking at here is that the way to grow the economy what I need to do is grow the output per worker. I need to make them more productive. And by making them more productive, they make more stuff, and that grows the economy. How do we do that? Well, we're going to have to make the people we're going to have to give the people more skills, train them better, maybe also give them more capital to work with, or make the technology that they're working with better. That would all be things that would help improve the economy. And you start to see that right there. Right? There's our productivity. Productivity numbers, more than anything else, determine how much people earn per hour, how much the economy grows by. So what we need to do is have policies, government policies, social policies that all make workers more productive, because it makes them richer and it helps grow the entire economy. And if you want to feel proud about yourself for living in the USA, we are the most productive economy in the world. We have the most productive workers by far. The Japanese may work longer hours, but we have more productive workers. You can grow an economy by how large it is, but you can be a very, very large economy like Russia. It has lots of resources, lots of land, but the economy is not growing as fast as Japan, which is a far, far smaller country and has almost no natural resources. Yet, it's a bigger economy, it has a higher GDP than Russia. Also, it doesn't really matter how many people you have. We can think of very big populations like China, like in India, that have 1 billion people each. The US has only a third of that. Yet the USA is a larger GDP. So again, yes, you'll have more output by having more workers, but not necessarily more output per person. What then becomes important is, what is your rate of population growth? China obviously knew this in the late 70s when they passed the one-child rule, right? Because they wanted to control the population so that everyone had more stuff per person. So critical to Chinese economic growth in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, until the rule was relaxed last year, was control the population growth by making it illegal to have more than one child. The alternative is that we can just tell people to have more knowledge, become more educated, get more skills. All of these investments in human capital will make the workers more productive. Alternatively, besides making people more educated and giving them greater skills, what I could do is give them more capital to work with. And the American farmer is our best example of this, is that they have GPS and they have fancy tractors and fancy technology, in terms of the machines they work with in the modern day farm that make them quite productive, much more productive than we would otherwise expect. Now, we also have to be concerned, though, is that the returns to that capital diminish over time. So a farmer having 3 tractors, the productivity increase from having the 3rd tractor isn't going to be as great as a farmer that previously was doing everything with animals, now all of a sudden has a tractor. Well, that farmer's going to be quite productive. Now, there is this idea in general among economists that you can have some level of a catch-up effect. Mongolia experienced this certainly in the 2000s, as well as a little bit in the 90s, was that it was a developing country that didn't previously have great amounts of capital, and then all of a sudden had this capital, and then the economy grew quite rapidly. But it reaches a point where it plateaus, meaning that the growth rate slows significantly. That's what Mongolia is experiencing right now, because the individuals then have the compute, right? I mean, not having a cell phone in Mongolia would be quite rare today, not having one. Whereas 10 years ago, they were far and few between. So then obviously that developing country grew quite quickly as people got cell phones, and then it slows down. So technology matters. It's not just cool electronic gadgets that make our lives more interesting by connecting us more with others, but we do, at least on some level, become more productive. That in turn raises our standard of living, increases the growth in the economy. So when we look at everything overall, then we get our total factor productivity. That would then be the way in which the inputs become more useful. So it's not that I'm increasing the number of inputs, but that the inputs themselves are more useful. And inputs become more useful, right, to the effect that they become more effective. How inputs become more effective could be maybe I have new processes that combine those inputs in a better way with the outputs. Now, probably the most pessimistic economist, one of the more pessimistic economists in history would have been Thomas Malthus. The equivalent group today is called the Club of Rome, if you want to look that up on the internet. These are basically economists and others that then predict that things are going bad in the economy, that pretty soon we will not grow as fast as we need to, and that the economy, that we will all suffer because the economy did not keep up to what we all needed. So Malthus predicted that the population was growing so fast that we wouldn't be able to grow the food that we needed, and that economic growth was slow to non-existent. Well, the prediction didn't come true. The prediction didn't come true because even though the land isn't growing, the farmers in Europe became more productive and able to accommodate the larger population. That's something that Malthus himself wasn't able to take into account. Again, I'm skipping checkpoints simply because you have these slides, and this would be the way that you know that you're keeping up with what I'm doing here. The other way that we could grow the economy is by having a better infrastructure. Infrastructure is so important and is largely the reason why in developing economies, why the economy is developing. Because these things are not here. Mongolia has almost none of those things. It has a very poor road system, very poor public education, It has only one train line that goes from China to Russia through Mongolia. The telecommunication system, there's no landlines or high-speed internet once you leave the capital. Everything is on cell phones, which cell phones are fine, but you can't do a lot of things with just a cell phone network. To invest in the infrastructure helps that economy grow. You may agree or disagree with rail and here in Hawaii. It's a contentious issue, and there's no necessarily right or wrong issue, but at least having a system to transport people from the west side of the island to town would probably be a good thing. Now, do we need rail versus more roads or better bridges or whatever? I'm not certain about the answer to that. I'm not a transportation person. But having a better infrastructure system, as an economist, it's hard for me to deny that helps the Hawaiian economy grow. And that's where government has a role, because government is the thing that carries these things out. Private companies can do it, but the problem is that private companies often lack the infrastructure. The debate we had about Hawaiian Electric, for instance, was part of this issue as well. In Kauai, the government, or it's a co-op that runs the electric, versus a private company. Government also plays a role. Obviously, this is I work for the University of Hawaii, so that's a public access thing. And not only then does the Hawaii legislature and the Hawaii government give everyone access to education, kindergarten through 12th grade, then the issue is, okay, what do we need to do to expand that, Should we give people access to the first 2 years of college at one of the community colleges? Should we give everyone access to preschool, These are things where we have to then have a public debate about, should we have more growth, by the government providing more education, I mean, if you want to make one criticism about Hawaii is that there's a lack of access to preschools, that if you're rich enough to be able to afford it, and in full disclosure, it's not that I'm rich, but at least, I can put my child in preschool. Okay, well, that makes me in a more privileged position, and fully admitting it here, it makes me in a more privileged position than someone who can't afford to have their child go to preschool. Well, already now we've started to make things unfair for children, Is that my child now has an unfair advantage over a child who might be very skilled and knowledgeable, but they just didn't have the resources to go to preschool, That would be part of the debate we could have about this kind of thing, Should government have that role? Or do we want to allow children to only have access to kindergarten? Same with college, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to college, so are all of you, since you're in this class. You can think of your classmates in high school who might have been very well skilled, but just didn't have the access to pay to go, even to community college. The government as well can play a role in funding research centers. This summer, I spent a month funded by the federal government to do my research on Mongolia, to work with others in Mongolia, in Pennsylvania. So I went to Pennsylvania to work with others on issues that are facing Mongolia. That was all funded by the federal government. Why does the government care? Well, it makes me a better scholar. It makes more scholarship and better knowledge about how developing economies grow. That helps the U.S. economy grow. Why else is the government important? Well, the big thing is that even if you have a belief that government is best when it's very small, which is a perfectly legitimate belief, not trying to overly promote here that the government needs to have a role, but the government at a minimum has to have a role in creating a legal system, having a rule of law for how disputes are settled. There needs to be a financial system where I can have checks processed, where I can have a money system exist. You cannot grow an economy without the government at least imposing these kinds of structures. What do we see in developing economies? We often see a lack of these two things. When I was in doing the work on Mongolia last month, there were 3 lawyers there, all working in the legal system in Mongolia, right? So you get this idea that this isn't, how you make an economy grow isn't rocket science, is that we do know how to make an economy grow. We just then have to somehow convince Mongolia to establish and enforce a legal system, which is hard to do because there are those who benefit from the lack of the legal system, right? Because now they get to buy their way into what they want. What do we mean by having a legal system? That would mean, again, contract rights that can be legally enforced. That would mean that I have people that create patents and copyrights, that we can protect their innovations, and that those property rights are well defined. How else I can do it is I need to have that currency that is relatively stable. I need to have those credit institutions that allow for loans to be made. Here's my well-functioning financial system. This is a bit more of my area of expertise, and the things that I do to help the country of Mongolia grow would be to talk about these things. More specifically, my focus is on the stock market in Mongolia, how you make that kind of thing exist, right? Stock markets help companies raise funds that they need to grow. Well, that's part of the financial system for the economy. And then what you also want to see with, in terms of what the government can do to make the economy grow, you want to see it doing things in terms of not allowing the money supply to rapidly change, which means that I can then help control inflation and deflation. That's important because businesses and consumers need to have some stability about how prices are going to be changing. And the critique that's sometimes made against China, for instance, is that the government doesn't do enough to make the market perform competitively. And it's rightfully so, because it's not a pure market economy, right? It's a kind of a mixed market, centrally planned economy. And so that market is then less efficient, meaning that firms, right, have certain limits on what they can do. Individuals also face limits on what they can do. Well, the best way to look at all of these things then is with the index of economic freedom. What it does is it takes into account all the things that we were kind of talking about here and puts it all together into a single index number. And you can look this up on the web, and you can kind of get an idea of how certain countries compare to each other. Okay. That largely takes into account then how economies grow, and that finishes this general macroeconomic discussion. What follows now in part 3 of this course, which is the last 3 lectures, is that we're then going to specifically talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy, how I make an economy grow and stabilize it over the business cycle.